Montana Territory, 1883. The wind hit hard across the Helena depot as the noon train whistled in, steam hissing around iron wheels. Tanith O'Dell held tight to her carpetbag, her gloved fingers white-knuckled, her jaw clenched against the cold and the ache in her chest. Behind her, the platform buzzed with men in wool coats and women clutching children, but all she could hear was the cry of her daughter, Hope, drifting from memory. "I am not going back," she whispered to herself. She stepped forward, boot heels striking the wooden planks, eyes locked on the conductor raising his arm. Just a few more feet and she would be gone from this place, from the ranch, from the shame, from him. But then a hand caught hers. Tanith stopped cold. It was rough and warm, fingers calloused from rope and saddle leather. She turned fast, ready to snap, but the words died in her throat when she saw him, Zeke Branner. He looked older than she remembered, more sun in his skin, more weight in his eyes, but it was him. Same sandy brown hair, same cut jaw, same quiet strength he had worn like a second skin since they were children chasing fireflies in the cottonwoods. "Stay with me," he said low, his voice catching in the steam. She shook her head, eyes stinging. "Zeke, you do not know." "I know enough," he said, stepping closer. "You are running, but you do not have to. I cannot stay, not after what happened." Zeke's hand stayed on hers. "You think I care that he left you with nothing but a daughter and a broken heart? You think anyone with sense would blame you for what that man did?" Her lower lip trembled. "They do. I do not." Tanith swallowed hard. She had not seen Zeke since the spring she married that traveling gambler, thinking he had changed. He had not. 3 years, 1 child, and a dozen broken promises later, the man had vanished, leaving behind debts and whispers that clung to her like burrs. "She deserves more," Tanith whispered. "Hope deserves more than this town." Zeke's gaze softened. "Then let me help give it to her. You do not have to run to do right by her." Tanith looked past him, toward the hills where the wind carried the scent of pine and horses and the smoke from his chimney. His ranch solid, honest, built with his own hands, a place she once knew like her own skin. "Please," he said, his voice low and steady. "Stay." The conductor shouted, "All aboard." Tanith stepped back from the train. Her heart pounded so loud she felt it in her throat. Zeke released her hand only to take her bag gently from her fingers. She let him. They walked off the platform together, side by side, Hope's name unspoken between them but heavy in the air. The wagon ride to Zeke's ranch was quiet, the wheels crunching over frozen dirt, the sky pale with snow clouds. Tanith sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She had not been this close to him in years. "I did not know you were still here," she said finally. "I was waiting," Zeke replied simply. "You were not ready yet." She turned to look at him. "You were waiting for me." He glanced at her, nodding once. "I always figured you would come back. Just hoped I would still be here when you did." Tanith looked back at the road, her throat tight with something that felt like hope and fear all tangled together. They arrived just before dusk. The ranch house stood strong against the wind, smoke curling from the chimney. A little girl with chestnut braids burst from the porch, her cheeks pink and her dress tucked into her boots. "Mama," Hope cried, running across the yard. Tanith caught her daughter in her arms, lifting her high, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I missed you, baby," she whispered into her hair. Zeke stood back, watching them. Hope looked over Tanith's shoulder and squinted at him. "Who is he?" Tanith turned. "This is Mr. Branner. He is a friend. We are going to stay here for a little while." Hope tilted her head. "Does he have cows?" Zeke chuckled. "Plenty. Do you have a dog too?" "Two," he said. "One of them likes to sleep by the fire." Hope nodded solemnly. "Okay, then I think we can stay." Tanith laughed softly, brushing hair from her daughter's face. Her eyes met Zeke's across the yard, and for a moment the world felt still. That night the fire crackled low in the hearth. Hope had fallen asleep, curled up with the red dog, her thumb in her mouth. Tanith stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching Zeke stir the coals. "She will be safe here," he said without turning. "I know." He looked at her then, his face open. "You too." Tanith hesitated, then stepped into the room. "I am scared," Zeke straightened. "Of what?" "Of feeling something again, of hoping." He stepped close. "You do not have to be scared with me." She blinked fast, tears threatening again. You sure about that? Zeke reached up, brushing a thumb along her cheekbone. I am more sure of you than I have ever been of anything. She leaned into his touch, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. His heart beat steady beneath her fingers. You waited, she whispered. I would wait again, he said. Tanith's breath caught. She touched her lips to his cheek, soft and trembling. Zeke did not move. He just held her gaze, steady as the ground beneath their feet. I am not going anywhere, she said finally. Good, he murmured. Because I am just getting started. The bell above the barn door clanged once in the wind as Tanith stepped inside, the scent of hay and saddle soap catching in her throat. She had never expected to cross this threshold again, not after all the years gone too far and too fast. But here it was. Solid walls, a roof that didn't leak, and Zeke pitching straw into the far stall like the last few years hadn't carved hollows in both of them. You always did stack hay tighter than anyone else, she said, voice light but not playful. Zeke turned, his brow damp beneath his hat. Old habits. Barn stays warmer this way. She moved toward the rail, brushing her gloved hand across the smooth wood. You keep it the same, he set the pitchfork aside. Thought about changing things. But I figured if something works, there's no sense in tearing it down. She nodded, eyes trailing over the bridles on their hooks. You still have dancer's tack, couldn't bring myself to part with it. Tanith let out a breath through her nose, quiet and sharp. She was a good horse. Zeke leaned against the stall post, arms folded. She carried you out of the canyon that spring flood. You remember? I remember the mud up to her knees, and you yelling for me not to let go of the reins. You didn't. No, I didn't. Her eyes went distant. I held on. Silence stretched between them, easy as the smell of pine smoke drifting through the rafters. Zeke's voice broke it, low and steady. You thinking of staying through winter? Tanith pressed her palm flat against the wood. I don't know yet. You should. She looked over her shoulder at him. You're not going to push me. I don't push, he said, but I plant seeds. Tanith gave the barest nod. You always were patient. I had to be, didn't I? His eyes didn't waver. You were fire and motion. I figured if I stood still long enough, maybe you'd circle back. Her throat tightened. I didn't mean to leave things the way I did. I know. I told myself if I stayed, I'd ruin everything good about you. Zeke stepped closer, the dust quiet beneath his boots. You never had that kind of power, not over what's good in me. She met his eyes, steady now. I used to think you were a fool for staying here, for not chasing something bigger. And now I think maybe you understood something I didn't. Hope's voice rang from the yard, clear and urgent. Mama, come see the tracks. Tanith turned toward the open door, the light catching the edge of her face. Coyote, rabbit, Zeke said, already moving to follow. We get a dozen of them every morning along the north fence. Tanith paused just long enough to look back at him. You always did know how to read the land, and people, he added. When I take my time, she didn't answer. Just gave a small nod and stepped out into the snow-glint morning. Hope danced near the fence line, her mittened hands pointing at the soft trails etched in white. Zeke crouched beside her, naming each one, voice low and certain. Tanith watched them from the porch, her fingers curled around the edge of the railing, wind tugged at her coat. She didn't look away. That evening, Zeke brought in kindling while Tanith set a tin of biscuits near the stove. Hope lay on her belly near the fire, coloring with a stub of charcoal on scrap paper. She made a picture of your barn, Tanith said, sliding the kettle onto the hobs. Zeke glanced down at the sketch. She's got a good eye. Must get it from you. I never could draw. She sees things clear, though. I think she's just happy to be still for a minute. Tanith poured water into the tin basin and reached for the cloth. Zeke pulled off his gloves, setting them near the door. You ever think about teaching again? Her hands stilled. After everything, she shook her head once. No one send their children to me. You'd be surprised. Folks around here remember what you did before you left. Tanith wrung out the rag, the steam rising between them. They might remember. But they don't forget. Zeke stepped forward, voice quiet. You're not who you were then, and even if you were, you still deserve to build something. She met his gaze. You really believe that? I've never believed anything more. Tanith stared at him, something loosening behind her ribs. I don't know what to do with kindness that doesn't expect something back. Zeke held her gaze. Then stay long enough to learn. The kettle whistled, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness. Hope stirred near the hearth. Tanith turned, lifting the pot. She didn't say anything more, but her shoulders eased a little, like something inside her had shifted just enough to breathe. Outside, snow began to fall light and slow and steady. The first hard frost came overnight, brittle lace on the window panes and a crispness in the air that made breath visible even by lantern light. Tanith rose early, not out of habit, but because the quiet before dawn felt kinder than the hours that came after. She dressed by the stove's fading embers and set a pot of oats to boil, careful not to wake Hope. Zeke's chickens stirred in their coop when she stepped outside. The cold bit her cheeks, but the sky was a deep violet, and the stillness around the ranch made her feel steadier than she had in years. She walked the perimeter fence without reason beyond the need to move, to feel the earth solid beneath her boots. By the time she returned, Zeke had come in from the barn, his coat slung over a chair and his hands scrubbed clean. "I saw you out by the north line," he said, reaching for the coffee tin. "Didn't think you'd be up yet." "I was awake anyway," Tanith replied, unwrapping a cloth of butter she'd found in the root cellar. He poured 2 cups, setting one beside her. "You always did walk when your mind was full." She didn't answer at first. Then, "I need to find work." Zeke leaned his hip against the table. "There's a widow in town, Mrs. Caldwell. She's running the mercantile alone since her son went north to Butt. She might need help. Wages. Modest. But steady, and she's not the type to ask questions she doesn't need answers to." Tanith stirred her oats. "I'll speak to her." Zeke watched her a moment longer. "You don't have to prove anything to me." "I'm not trying to," she said gently. "I'm trying to prove it to myself." Hope shuffled into the room, hair sticking out and eyes half-lidded. She climbed into Zeke's lap without hesitation, laying her head against his chest. He didn't flinch or look surprised, just held her steady while Tanith set her bowl down. "She always this quiet in the morning?" he asked. "Only when she feels safe." Zeke pressed his cheek to the top of Hope's head. "Then I reckon we're doing something right." Later that day, Tanith rode into town with the borrowed mare, wrapped in her wool shawl and keeping her spine straight despite the nerves. The mercantile stood just past the livery, its windows fogged, the front steps swept clean. Mrs. Caldwell was inside, sleeves rolled, ledger open. "I heard you were back," she said before Tanith could speak. "I was hoping you might need help." The older woman eyed her a long moment, then nodded toward the shelves. "You can start by sorting the flour sacks from the cracked ones." Tanith didn't ask about pay. She just slipped behind the counter and got to work. By week's end, she had a rhythm mercantile in the mornings, home by supper, Hope tucked into her cot by the fire. She rarely saw Zeke during daylight, except in passing, but every evening he made sure his chair was pulled close to hers, their silence companionable. One night, after Hope had fallen asleep, Tanith reached for the tin of mending beside her chair. A shirt of Zeke's lay folded on top, torn beneath the shoulder. She threaded her needle without asking permission. He watched her from across the hearth. "You don't have to fix that." "I want to," he nodded once. "I rode out to the edge of the property today." She glanced up, needle paused. "Something wrong?" "No, just clearing trail, but I found the old swing you made out of rope and pine. That was years ago, still strong, ropes frayed but the knots holding." She smiled faintly. "We tied it together with horsehair." "You said it would never last." "I was wrong." She didn't speak for a long while. "Then I thought I'd come back here and just rest, maybe mend, but I didn't expect to feel anything more than that." Zeke leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And now, I'm starting to want things again." "That's harder than I thought it'd be." He looked at her steadily, something quiet and unwavering in his gaze. "Wanting's not weakness. It means there's still something inside you worth protecting." Tanith set the mended shirt aside. "I don't know what comes next." "You don't have to," he said. "You just have to keep choosing not to run." The fire cracked between them, and outside the wind shifted. Not harsh, not bitter, just the sound of a land settling toward winter. She reached across the space and touched his hand, fingers barely brushing his. He turned his palm to meet hers. Their hands stayed there, resting together like a promise made without words. The morning frost softened under a thin sun, and the air carried the smell of damp wood and iron. Tanith stood at the back of the mercantile, retying the twine around a crate of dried beans. She wore her hair pinned back, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hands bore the small scrapes of work she didn't mind earning. Mrs. Caldwell raised her head from the ledger. "You've got a good head for order, Miss O'Dell." "You ever think about running a place like this?" Tanith finished the knot and straightened. "Not until lately." "Well," the woman said, closing the book, "there's talk of the railway pushing north again. More folks'll come through. Someone like you could do well with a storefront." Tanith didn't answer right away. She wiped her hands on a rag and looked out the window. The snow had melted in patches, and wagon tracks cut through the muddy street. "I suppose I never let myself picture anything past a season. You do fine if you did." Tanith turned back, her voice low. "I might have once before." Mrs. Caldwell didn't press. She simply placed a folded note on the counter. "Mr. Branner left this before sunrise. Said to give it to you?" Tanith took it silently. She unfolded the paper by the stove, its edges warm from her palm. His handwriting was plain, each letter careful. "Fence post split by the creek, riding out to mend it. Supper might be late." She read it twice before slipping it into her pocket. By the time she returned home, the sun had dipped behind the ridge. Hope sat cross-legged on the rug, humming to herself while she stitched a scrap of muslin. Tanith crouched beside her, brushing a loose thread from the child's brow. "Where'd you learn that stitch?" she asked. "Mr. Branner showed me, said it was the kind that doesn't pull too tight." Tanith smoothed the fold of her skirt. "He's right." She let the girl be and walked to the back door. The horizon lay dusted in orange and gray, and the line of cottonwoods by the creek stood bare and still. She fetched her shawl and crossed the yard, following the ridge path worn by hooves and boots. She found Zeke near the water, crouched beside a cedar post, hammer in hand. He didn't look up as she approached. "I thought supper would be late," she said. "It will be," he replied. "This was worse than I figured." She knelt across from him. "You should have let me help. I was going to ask, then I thought maybe you needed quiet." "I did." She hesitated, "but not for as long as I thought." He wiped his hand across his brow, then held out a fresh length of wire. "Hold this steady." She took it between her palms, keeping it taut. The wind stirred the grass around them, and the creek whispered just beyond. Zeke hammered the staple into the wood, the sound sharp and final. "You meant what you wrote?" she asked. "Every word." Tanith didn't look away. "You trusted me, even when I left. I didn't stop. I think I forgot what that kind of trust felt like." He leaned back on his heels. "Then let me remind you." She wrapped the wire once more around the post, then let it fall. "I want to stay." Zeke didn't move right away. Then he stood and reached for her hand, pulling her up gently. "Then you're home." They walked back together, boots silent on the packed earth. When they reached the house, the light from the windows spilled warm across the yard. Hope stood in the doorway, one hand raised in greeting, the other clutching her muslin square. Zeke paused at the steps. "I could build another room, give her space of her own." Tanith's eyes lifted to his. "You've already given her more than I ever could have asked." He opened the door, held it for them both, and when Tanith stepped inside, her shoulders no longer carried the weight of leaving. A warmth settled beneath her ribs, not sudden, not loud, but steady. Zeke followed, quiet as always, but when his hand brushed hers beneath the table later, she didn't pull away. She held it there, fingers threaded through his, and they stayed that way while the wind curled around the eaves and the fire burned slow and low. The thaw came slow, seeping into the ground day by day until the earth softened enough to take a bootprint again. Calves bawled from the lower pasture, and the fence lines dried to mud. Tanith hung linens on the rope strung between the porch beams. Her sleeves rolled as the wind tugged at the wet fabric. It had been weeks since she'd first unpacked her bag, and not once had she reached for it again. Inside, Hope was seated near the hearth with a slate and chalk, sounding out letters under her breath. Zeke had found her a primer at the old schoolhouse, long since shuttered. He'd brought it home without fuss, the cover worn but the pages intact. Zeke stepped onto the porch, rubbing his neck with the back of his hand. "I let the cattle out onto the south slope. They'll eat better there now that the grass is showing." Tanith pinned the last sheet. I was thinking we could plant something along the west wall, maybe beans. The soil's warmer there. He leaned a shoulder against the post. You planning to stay that long? She didn't look at him right away. I'm not planning to leave. Zeke watched her fingers fold the empty clothespin bag. That still feels strange to say. It feels like I've finally stopped holding my breath. He studied her, quiet settling between them like the shade of the porch. Then he stepped closer, the boards creaking under his boots. I finished building that table you mentioned. The one with the extra drawer for your sewing things. She looked up. You did. I figured something that's used daily ought to fit the hand that uses it. Tanith smiled, slow and full. You always notice the right things. He reached up and gently tucked a curl behind her ear, rough fingers brushing her cheek. I notice you, Tanith. She didn't speak. Just stepped near enough that her shoulder touched his chest, and she stood there a long moment, the breeze tugging the sheets above them like sails. That evening, after supper, Zeke pulled a small box from the shelf above the hearth. Hope was already asleep, curled beneath the quilt Tanith had finished just days before. Zeke didn't say anything. He just placed the box in Tanith's hands and waited. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a ring plain, silver, with a single band of engraved pine branches circling it. She looked up, her breath caught. I know you never needed saving, he said, but I'd be honored to build a life with you, one where you never have to question where you belong. Tears rimmed her lashes, but her voice stayed steady. I never thought I'd be asked like this. Not by someone who saw all of me and stayed. He reached for her hand, folding it between his. I only ever wanted to walk beside you, she nodded once. Then let's start walking. They married in the early spring beneath the cottonwoods near the creek. Mrs. Caldwell stood as witness, and Hope carried a small bouquet of wild sage and early crocus. The ceremony was quiet, just as they wanted, with Zeke's hand steady in hers and the sun warm on their backs. Tanith wore a dress she stitched herself, and Zeke trimmed his beard for the first time in over a year. When they exchanged vows, it wasn't with grand words but with promises that had already been lived out day by day. Afterward, they shared bread and dried apples at the table Zeke had built, with Hope sitting between them, swinging her feet by early summer. Tanith had taken over half the mercantile's bookkeeping, and Zeke had built a bench beneath the birch trees where Hope liked to read aloud. The garden grew in neat rows, the beans curling up twine lines, and in the evenings they sat on the porch, listening to the cicadas rise from the grass. One night, as dusk settled and the fields turned gold, Tanith rested her head on Zeke's shoulder. You know, she said softly, I think I finally believe in something again. He kissed her temple, his voice low against her skin. What's that? That this life, this home, it's ours, not borrowed, not temporary, just ours? Zeke wrapped his arm around her, his thumb brushing the edge of her sleeve. It always was, we just had to find our way back to it. She nodded, her eyes on the horizon, and for the first time in years, she didn't wonder what was coming next. She didn't need to. She had Zeke, she had Hope. She had home,